So if you add those two things together, the notion that these lags between investments in R&D and realising these output and productivity consequences, in our view, are really, really long. So we started off professionally modelling these lag lengths at about 5 years. Huffman and Emerson models that have been mimicked by many, many people in the literature set these lag lengths around 30 to 34 years. In our more recent work, whilst conceptually one might conceive that on average the lag length is infinite, practically, empirically, where we could let the data talk as much as we could let it talk, we get a lag structure of around 50 years as our preferred lag structure. It isn't that you wait 50 years to have an impact, but that's the average lag from when you invest in R&D to exacerbate the measured productivity consequences of that R&D with a peak effect of around 24 years. So I would argue that if we're sort of thinking, wanting to think over the next 30, 40 or 50 years, we maybe want to look back longer than 30, 40 or 50 years to get a sense of the longer run dynamics with respect to production and productivity growth. So I tried to start digging back to some data that predates 1961, where most of us, and myself included, have done most of our analyses because that's where we can lay our hands on the available FAO data. And so I've been chipping away for 4 or 5 or 6 years, and still a work in progress, but there's I'll report on some of the progress here to take this longer run perspective and try and push our views of production and productivity growth back around a century or so. So if you look at global production, population and agricultural area growth trends, what I've done here is got 3 snapshots in the first part of the 20th century from 1908 to 1930, from the 1930 to the 1960 period, and from 1960 to 2008. And so this is an estimate of global production growth, and so it's not that we didn't have any growth in the first part of the 20th century. My estimates are that output was growing. This is a real measure of agricultural output globally. Was growing about 1.62% per annum. Grew about the same in the middle part of the century. In the latter part of the century, 1960 through to 2008, was growing at about 2.16%. We can see what we all know, put some numbers on it too, is this sort of gradual decline in the rate of growth of the expansion of the footprint of agriculture. So we have agricultural area growing by just 0.2% globally in the 1960 to 2008 period, where it was growing upwards around 0.8% in that early part of the decade. And this gradual ramping up, as we're familiar with on the blue bar chart there, of the rate of growth of population throughout the last century. So if you add all that up together and look at how juxtapose the output growth rate, real output growth rate with respect to real population growth rate, and in this case divvy it up not in total but across specific commodities, and these are global estimates of global production on maize, rice, soybeans and wheat, juxtaposed against global population growth. We got in wheat and rice in particular, another day of soybeans doesn't go back that far, pretty substantial rates of growth in per capita output of those two commodities, pretty miserly rates of growth of output with respect to maize in the first part of the last century. In the 30s to the 60s, a ramping up of the rates of growth for maize, and actually a ramping down the rates of growth per capita on wheat and rice. And in the last period that I've got here, a substantial increase per capita in the rate of growth of maize, per capita maize production. Some modest increases in wheat and rice production, and still a very hefty rate of growth in per capita soybean production. So this sort of shifting dynamics of population growth rate and shifting dynamics of the underlying growth in population have played their hand out as best I can estimate over the last century in this fashion here. A point of note is that looking globally, one of the things personally I've just become more conscious of in the last few years is this notion that we think of agriculture taking this very expansive footprint globally, and the estimates are that about 41 or 42% of the world's land mass is some notionally under agriculture. This is either under arable land or permanently cropped or permanently pastured land. If you take an economic look at the spatial extent of production, what I've done here is just arrayed 148 countries and estimated their 2006 to 2008 share of the global value of production. And you get a very different view of the world. And it turns out that if you take the top 5 producers, you're accounting for 55% of the entire world's agricultural output, by my estimates. It's a huge spatial concentration in the economic location of production as opposed to the physical location of production. And if you actually track across maize, wheat and rice, you get a similar sort of pattern. So take the top 10 maize producers and you've got nearly 80% of the entire world's maize crop. Just take the US alone and it bounces around. Just in this particular period, the US is 37%, but typically it's around 40% of the entire world's corn crops grown in the US. Around 70% of the entire world's wheat crop is grown in the top 10 countries, and a whopping 86% of the entire world's rice crop is grown in the top 10 producers in the world. So this changes my view about what you might want to worry about when trying to think about global projections of productivity and production and its implications for aggregate output and price effects and so forth. You've got this massive economic concentration in production. That was a snapshot of now, and there's a question about whether that concentration has persisted or was evident over the last century or so. So what we've got is a reasonably clean set of data of total global production broken down by regions and countries of the world for these principal 15 field crops back to the early 20th century. So it's most of the big ticket items in terms of field crops in the world. And the bar charts indicate in real terms the value of production of those field crops over time. You can see this ramping up in the value of the production globally from the 1960 snapshot to the 2008 snapshot. But just look where in the world these crops were grown. So back in the 1930s, Europe, North America and Oz and New Zealand, by these estimates, counted for over 52% of the entire world's production. But now, Asia accounts for 44% of the entire world's production, and Europe accounts for about 26%. So it's not that production's gone down, but you've got this big shift in the locus of the share of production globally. So it seems, from what I can know now, that there's been this persistence in the spatial concentration of production. It's just that we've changed where in the world that production is taking place. So if you do it on a country count, it is, as best I can estimate, these sort of high share indexes for the top 5 or top 10 producers are sort of being persistent by commodity all the way back, but there's been a shuffling in who's in that top 10 gradually over time. So I think that has consequences for us thinking over these longer sweeps, time period sweeps, about the potential prospects for productivity and production worldwide. So that's a bit of a view on sort of production. What do we know about productivity in the long run? I co-direct a big project for the Gates Foundation, and we've spent a hell of a lot of Gates' money, hopefully being useful to them. But one of the things we've done is develop some very unique maps of where in the world the principal crops grow. So we actually have 20 of these maps, and you can get them free from our website if you manipulate geo's data sets and so forth. And essentially what we've got is these footprints of where in the world. I've just put up here our maize, wheat, soybean and rice crops. And you would have thought we'd know that, but it turns out in a pixelated fashion. This is on a 10 by 10 kilometre grid for the entire world, so it's a hell of a lot of data. A very massive process to collect the data and process it up and ground truth it and so forth. So these are what we call a plausible spatial distribution of where in the world these crops are. And if you just sort of focus in on North America, you can see the sort of footprint for maize is quite different than the footprint for wheat, so ridges up in Richard Gray's farm and elsewhere. And the footprint for rice is quite different again. And if you look at these maps in detail, you can see that. What I've got here is an array of, so not only where in the world this production takes place, but what are the yield relativities in a pixelated fashion worldwide, starting from the dark blue. So I've just broken the yield profiles up to sort of standardise all of the yield levels on the slide here. So we've broken up the yield levels into deciles. And what we did was we went and interrogated the database, and this is a surprise to us, and we said, okay, let's take the share of the world's high-yielding areas. So I took the highest 3 deciles of the highest yield areas in the world, and we wanted to see where in the world those high-yielding locations ended up. So it turns out, by our estimates, that the US accounts for nearly 1/3 of the higher-yielding pixels worldwide for maize, just over 1/4, and ditto for soybeans, for wheat and soybeans at the high-yielding areas, and rice about 5.3%. Surprise to me, I interrogated where Australia fitted in this international pecking order in terms of yield performance, and we're outgunned by sub-Saharan Africa across all of those crops, which was a surprise to me. Probably shouldn't do when you think about it, by non-trivial orders of magnitude. So in terms of, there's a much higher distribution of high-yielding pixels in sub-Saharan Africa for those 4 crops than there is in Australia. Again, that's a snapshot, and we've been very interested in trying to see how these yield profiles have evolved over time. And we're learning something really interesting here, and I haven't actually fully absorbed the consequences of this, but I think it's of import when we're trying to think about productivity and production performance. So what I've done here is we've taken, this is now country average yields for wheat, maize and rice, and we've pushed them back just over a century. And what I've arrayed here is a density function of the distribution across countries in yield performance. Okay? So the red density kernel there shows you the distribution averaged over the 2 decades of the first part of the 20th century. And the blue distribution arrays this yield performance across countries in the more recent couple of decades. And you see something that we all know, that the sort of central tendencies, in this case the median of those distributions, is moving to the right. But you see something else quite profound, it seems to me, that there's this substantial increase in the spatial distribution, in this, my productivity measure here being yield, of productivity performance across countries on average from the first part of the last century to now. Also to note that there's a very high positive skewness to these distributions in both then and now periods, but this shifted increase in the spatial dispersion in yield performance is something I was totally unaware of. This student of mine who's been documenting a lot of this work has got some very detailed data. I'll show you a snapshot of it, where it's county level data in the US going back into the 1870s, and we're seeing exactly the same trend across counties as we're seeing across countries. In other words, you've got this, in fact, I'll show you, this huge spatial agglomeration in production, but at the same time an increasing dispersion in yield performance across counties, just like we're seeing here across countries. This argues to me that there's something location-specific or site-specific that we need to pay serious attention to if we're really going to get to an understanding of, in this case, yield performance and more generally productivity performance. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on in the talk. For those of you who've read Vern Rattan and Hayami's work, this should be familiar to you. Julian and I dubbed this from a tanagram. It's been around for a while, but I've inherited maintaining it, unfortunately, passing very suddenly a few years ago. And what this is also emphasising, and Vern laid some economics on this, and understanding that we have these, again, big structural differences across regions and countries in the world in terms of their productivity performances. So what we've got on the vertical axis is a measure of land productivity. On the horizontal axis, a measure of labour productivity. There's a log scale on both of these, so that means that the length of the locuses represent an indication of the rates of change in productivity. And all of these locuses move from in a northeasterly direction. So they're starting in 1961 on the left and moving to 2008 on the right. The diagonals indicate factor ratios, land-labour ratios, and you can see, as you'd expect, big structural differences in land-labour ratios between China and Japan, which are working around 1 to 2 to 3 or 4 hectares per worker, up to Australia, which is around 800